The scream that split the air wasn't human. Or at least that's what Wade Rourke thought when he first heard it echoing through the cottonwood trees near the abandoned Fletcher Ranch. He'd been tracking elk through the foothills of the Sacramento Mountains for 3 days, his buckskin gelding picking its way carefully through the rocky terrain as the late afternoon sun beat down on his weathered leather hat. It was July 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was suffering through one of the hottest summers on record. Wade had planned to make camp near the creek that ran through what used to be Fletcher land before the old man died, and his no-good son sold off everything that wasn't nailed down and disappeared east. But that sound, that desperate wail that was somehow both animal and achingly human, made every muscle in his 6'4" frame go rigid. Wade pulled his horse to a stop, his calloused hand instinctively moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. His long, dark hair, pulled back with a leather thong, was damp with sweat beneath his hat. The mountains had been his home for the better part of a decade, ever since he'd left the ranch he'd grown up on in Texas after his family was killed in a Comanche raid. At 32 years old, he'd become something of a legend in the territory, a solitary figure who brought meat to the towns when game was scarce, and who could track anything that moved through the wilderness. His broad shoulders and muscular frame were testament to years of hard living, his arms thick from swinging axes and hauling game, his chest solid as oak beneath his worn cotton shirt. He'd been told more than once that he cut an intimidating figure, especially with the dark stubble that usually covered his square jaw and the intense gray eyes that seemed to see everything. The sound came again, weaker this time, and Wade's jaw clenched. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He urged his horse forward, moving with purpose toward the cluster of buildings that made up the old Fletcher place. The main house looked like it had been stripped bare, windows broken and door hanging off its hinges. But the barn, that old red structure that Fletcher had been so proud of, still stood intact. And that's where the sound was coming from. Wade dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the hard, packed earth with barely a sound. Years in the mountains had taught him to move quietly, and he approached the barn with caution. The door was closed, secured with a heavy padlock that looked far too new compared to the weathered wood surrounding it. That set off alarm bells in his head. Why would someone padlock an abandoned barn? He pressed his ear to the door and heard it, breathing, rapid and shallow, and then a small whimper that made his blood run cold. It was definitely human, and it was definitely a woman. "Hello," Wade called out, his deep voice firm but not threatening. "Can you hear me in there?" There was a scuffling sound, then silence. "I'm not going to hurt you," Wade continued. "My name is Wade Rourke. I'm going to get you out of there." He examined the padlock, a massive iron thing that would take considerable force to break. Wade had that force. He retrieved his hunting axe from his saddle and returned to the door. With 3 powerful swings, he shattered the lock mechanism, the metal screeching in protest before the door swung open. The smell hit him first. Unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sickly sweet scent of infection. Wade's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim interior, and when they did, rage unlike anything he'd felt in years surged through his veins. A woman was chained to one of the support posts in the center of the barn. Not tied, chained, like an animal. Heavy iron shackles bound her wrists and were connected by a short length of chain to a bolt driven into the wooden post. She was sitting on the dirt floor, her legs drawn up to her chest, and she stared at him with wide, terrified eyes that were the most striking shade of green he'd ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with tangled brown hair that might have been beautiful if it wasn't matted with dirt and straw. Her dress, or what was left of it, was torn and filthy. Her feet were bare and covered in cuts. Even in the dim light, Wade could see the angry red marks around her wrists where the shackles had rubbed her skin raw. "Jesus Christ," Wade breathed, moving toward her slowly. She flinched backward, pressing herself against the post, and he immediately stopped. "Easy now. I'm here to help." "Who did this to you?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, probably from screaming. Wade noticed a tin cup lying on its side near her, empty except for a few drops of water. She'd been left here to die. "I'm going to get those chains off you," Wade said, keeping his voice steady and calm despite the fury burning in his gut. "I need to get close to do it. I promise I won't hurt you." She watched him with those huge green eyes, and slowly, so slowly, she gave the tiniest nod. Wade approached carefully, kneeling beside her in the dirt. Up close, he could see the full extent of her condition. She was severely dehydrated, her lips cracked and bleeding. There were bruises on her arms, her collarbone, the side of her face. She'd been beaten. Recently. "Can you tell me your name?" Wade asked as he examined the shackles. They were locked with another padlock, smaller than the one on the door but still solid. The woman opened her mouth again, and this time a raspy whisper emerged. "Nina." "Nina," Wade repeated, and something about the way he said her name, with such gentleness despite his rough appearance, made tears spring to her eyes. "Nina, I'm going to break this lock. It might be loud and I'll need to swing this axe near you, but I swear on my life I won't hit you. Do you understand?" She nodded again, and he saw her jaw clench, preparing herself. Wade positioned the chain so it was taut against the post, giving him a clear target away from her body. He raised his axe and brought it down with controlled force. Sparks flew as metal met metal, but the lock held. He swung again and again, the sound echoing through the barn. On the fourth strike, the lock shattered. Nina gasped as the chains fell away from her wrists, and she immediately brought her hands to her chest, cradling them. Wade set his axe aside and gently took one of her hands in his much larger ones. His touch was surprisingly tender for a man his size, and he carefully examined the wounds on her wrists. They needed to be cleaned and bandaged, and soon. "Can you walk?" Wade asked. Nina tried to move her legs and immediately whimpered in pain. Wade noticed then that her ankles were also swollen, probably from sitting in the same position for too long. He didn't want to think about how many days she'd been chained here. "All right," he said, making a decision. "I'm going to carry you." "Is that acceptable to you?" The fact that he asked, that he gave her a choice after everything that had clearly been taken from her, made Nina's tears spill over. She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Wade stood and then bent down, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, his muscular arms steady and sure. Nina was so weak that she couldn't help but lean her head against his broad chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt safe. Wade carried her out of that hell into the bright sunlight. Nina squeezed her eyes shut against the glare, having been in darkness for so long. He walked directly to his horse and somehow managed to pull his canteen from his saddle while still holding her. He uncapped it with his teeth and brought it to her lips. "Slow sips," he instructed. "I know you want to gulp it down, but slow sips or you'll be sick." Nina followed his instructions, the cool water like heaven on her parched throat. After a few sips, Wade capped the canteen and secured it back on his saddle. Then he did something that surprised her. He draped his jacket over her shoulders, covering her torn dress and giving her a measure of dignity and warmth despite the heat of the day. "I need to get you to a doctor," Wade said. "The nearest town is Roswell, about 8 miles west. Can you ride?" Nina shook her head weakly. She could barely sit up on her own, much less ride a horse. Wade nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then you'll ride with me. Hold on. With remarkable ease, he mounted his horse while still holding Nina, then settled her in front of him so she was sitting sideways across his lap, her head resting against his shoulder. One of his strong arms wrapped around her waist, holding her securely, while the other took up the reins. Nina felt the solid wall of his chest behind her, the strength in the arm that held her, and something inside her that had been wound tight with terror finally began to uncoil. She was safe. This mountain man, this stranger with the gentle voice and careful hands, had saved her. The ride to Roswell seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Nina drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally giving in to exhaustion now that she wasn't chained and alone. Every time she stirred, Wade was there, his voice low and reassuring in her ear. "You're all right, Nina. I've got you. Stay with me now. Nobody's going to hurt you again, I promise. Almost there. Doc Mason will fix you right up." By the time they reached Roswell, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with wooden buildings and a scattering of homes spreading out from the center. Wade rode straight to the doctor's office, a small white building with a painted sign hanging out front. "Doc." Wade called out, his voice carrying the urgency of the situation. "Doc Mason, I need you." The door opened immediately, and a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed spectacles and graying hair stepped out, wiping his hands on a towel. His eyes widened when he saw Wade holding the battered woman. "Good God, Wade, what happened?" "Found her chained in the old Fletcher barn," Wade said, dismounting with Nina still cradled in his arms. "Dehydrated, malnourished, infected wounds on her wrists and ankles. She's been beaten." Doc Mason's face darkened. He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Bring her in. Put her on the examination table." Wade carried Nina inside, the doctor's office smelling of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs. He laid her down gently on the padded examination table, and Nina's hand shot out, grabbing onto his wrist with surprising strength for someone in her condition. "Don't leave," she managed to whisper, her green eyes pleading. Wade looked at Doc Mason, who nodded. "You can stay, but stand over there while I examine her. Wade, you might want to go get Sheriff Coleman. If what you say is true, there's been a serious crime committed." "Can't that wait until morning?" Wade asked, his eyes still on Nina. "She's been through enough without having to answer a bunch of questions tonight." Doc Mason paused, then nodded. "You're right. Morning will do. Now step back and let me work." Wade moved to the corner of the room, but he stayed where Nina could see him, his presence solid and reassuring. Doc Mason worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning Nina's wounds, checking her for broken bones, listening to her heart and lungs. He asked her questions in a gentle voice, and Nina answered as best she could, though her responses were often just nods or shakes of her head. Finally, Doc Mason covered Nina with a clean sheet and turned to Wade. "She'll need to stay here tonight, possibly longer. Those wounds need careful tending and she needs rest and proper food. But she'll recover, physically, anyway." There was weight in those last words. Both men knew that the physical wounds were often easier to heal than the other kind. "What about payment?" Wade asked, reaching for the small leather pouch where he kept his earnings from selling furs and meat. Doc Mason waved him off. "We'll worry about that later. Right now, I'm more concerned about who did this." "Did she say?" Wade glanced at Nina, who had closed her eyes. "Not yet. Like you said, that conversation can wait until morning." "Where will you be staying?" "In case I need you, the boarding house, most likely, unless—" Wade looked at Nina again, something protective stirring in his chest. Unless you think she'll need someone here. I'll be here through the night, Doc Mason assured him. She'll be safe. You have my word. Go get some rest yourself. You look like you've been in the mountains for weeks. Wade nodded reluctantly. He approached the examination table once more, and Nina's eyes opened at the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. I'll be back first thing in the morning, Wade told her, his gray eyes intense. You're safe now, Nina. Doc Mason will take good care of you. Nina's hand found his again, her grip weak but determined. Thank you, she whispered, and there was a world of meaning in those two words. Wade gently squeezed her hand in return, careful of her injuries. Rest now. We'll talk tomorrow. It took everything in him to walk out of that doctor's office, but Wade forced himself to do it. Nina needed proper medical care and rest, and he needed to clean up and figure out what happened to her. Tomorrow, there would be questions that needed answering. Tonight, he needed to let her heal. Wade made his way to the boarding house, a two-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She took one look at his grim expression and didn't ask questions, just handed him a key and pointed him toward the washroom. Wade cleaned himself up, scrubbing away days of trail dust and the grime from that barn, but he couldn't scrub away the image of Nina chained to that post, looking at him with such fear and desperation in her eyes. He lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of his rented room, his mind churning. Someone had done that to her. Someone had beaten her, chained her, and left her to die in that barn. The rage that thought inspired was cold and sharp. Wade Rourke wasn't a violent man by nature, despite his size and strength. He preferred the solitude of the mountains, the company of animals over people. But he'd grown up in a time and place where justice was often rough and immediate, and every instinct he had was screaming for retribution. But first, he needed answers. And Nina needed protection, because whoever had done this to her might come looking to finish the job. True to his word, Wade was at Doc Mason's office before the sun was fully up. He knocked softly, and the doctor opened the door looking tired but satisfied. She had a good night, Doc Mason reported. Fever broke around midnight and she's been sleeping peacefully since. Her body is starting to heal. Can I see her? She's awake, actually, and she's been asking for you. Wade felt something warm unfurl in his chest at those words. He followed Doc Mason into the back room where Nina was lying on a proper bed now, covered with clean quilts. Her face had been washed, her hair brushed and braided by what must have been the doctor's wife. She looked young and fragile, her skin pale against the white pillow, but her green eyes were alert and focused on him as he entered. Morning, Wade said, removing his hat as he approached her bedside. How are you feeling? Better, Nina said, and her voice was stronger now, less of a rasp. Doc Mason says I was very lucky if you hadn't found me. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Wade pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, his hat balanced on his knee. Nina, I need to ask you some questions. Sheriff Coleman will want to know what happened, and more importantly, we need to know if whoever did this to you is still a threat. Can you tell me? Nina's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, her jaw setting with determination. His name is Garrett Fletcher. He's the son of the man who owned that ranch. His father died about 6 months ago, and Garrett came back from the east to settle the estate. Wade's eyes narrowed. He knew the name. Garrett Fletcher had a reputation in Roswell as a gambler and a drinker, someone who thought his family's former wealth entitled him to anything he wanted. I was working as a seamstress in town, Nina continued, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. My parents died of fever last winter and I was living alone trying to make my way. Garrett started coming by the shop where I worked, bringing his clothes to be mended. He seemed nice at first, polite, but then he started making comments, asking me to have dinner with him. I refused. I didn't like the way he looked at me. Wade's hands clenched into fists on his knees, but he kept his voice gentle. What happened? 2 weeks ago, he came to my room at the boarding house where I was staying. It was late at night. He was drunk. He forced his way in and... Nina's voice broke and she took a shaky breath. He tried to force himself on me. I fought him off, scratched his face. He got angry, so angry. He hit me, and when I tried to scream, he knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, I was in that barn, chained to the post. He said if he couldn't have me willingly, then no one would have me. He said he'd leave me there until I learned my place, or until I died. Whichever came first. The rage Wade had been holding at bay threatened to explode. His jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. Every muscle in his powerful body coiled with the need to do violence. But he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm for Nina's sake. Did he come back? After he chained you there? Nina nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Twice. The first time was after 2 days. He brought a little water and some stale bread, just enough to keep me alive. He said he was teaching me a lesson. The second time was 3 days later. He brought more water, but he also... Her voice dropped to a whisper. He hit me again when I refused to apologize, when I told him I'd rather die than submit to him. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know how long ago that was. The days and nights blurred together. Wade reached out and gently placed his large hand over her smaller one, being careful of the bandages on her wrist. That was 5 days ago, based on how dehydrated you were. Nina, I'm so sorry this happened to you, but I promise you, Garrett Fletcher will answer for what he's done. He'll deny it, Nina said bitterly. It's his word against mine, and he's a Fletcher, even if the family has fallen on hard times. I'm just an orphan seamstress. Who will believe me? I believe you, Wade said firmly. And Sheriff Coleman is a fair man. He'll believe you too, especially once he sees the state of that barn and those chains. There was a knock on the door, and Sheriff Coleman himself walked in, as if summoned by the mention of his name. He was a man in his 50s, weathered and hard but with honest eyes. He nodded to Wade and removed his hat when he saw Nina. Miss, he greeted her. I'm Sheriff Coleman. Doc Mason sent word that you might be able to tell me what happened. Nina repeated her story, her voice growing stronger with each word. Wade noticed that she sat up straighter, that her fear was being replaced by a righteous anger. She was stronger than she looked, this woman. Stronger than Garrett Fletcher had given her credit for. Sheriff Coleman took notes, his expression growing darker with each detail. I'll bring Garrett in for questioning, he said when Nina finished. And I'll need you to press formal charges, Miss Ashford, Nina supplied. Nina Ashford, Miss Ashford. Are you prepared to do that? Nina looked at Wade and he gave her an encouraging nod. She turned back to the sheriff. Yes, I want him to pay for what he did. Then he will, Sheriff Coleman promised. Wade, can I speak to you outside for a moment? Wade followed the sheriff out onto the wooden porch of the doctor's office. The morning sun was climbing higher and Roswell was coming to life around them. People were opening shops and a wagon rolled past heading for the general store. What do you need from me? Wade asked. Your testimony about the state you found her in, for one thing. The physical evidence will be important. But Wade, I need to warn you about something. Garrett Fletcher may not have the money his family once had, but he's got connections. His uncle is a judge over in Lincoln County. This could get complicated. Wade's eyes were cold as steel. Then it gets complicated, but that girl in there has already suffered enough. She deserves justice. I agree. I just wanted you to know what we might be up against. Sheriff Coleman paused, studying Wade carefully. You planning on staying in town for a while, or are you heading back to the mountains? Wade hadn't thought about it, but the answer came to him immediately. I'm staying. At least until this is resolved. Nina doesn't have anyone else, and I'm not leaving her to face this alone." Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly, a hint of approval in his eyes. "That's good. She'll need someone in her corner. I'll go find Fletcher now. Shouldn't be too hard. He's usually at the saloon by mid-morning." As the sheriff walked away, Wade stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out at the town. He'd always preferred the solitude of the mountains, the simplicity of survival out in the wild. But something had changed the moment he'd opened that barn door and seen Nina chained there. He couldn't just walk away, not from her. Maybe not ever. When Wade returned to Nina's room, she was sitting up in bed, sipping broth that Doc Mason's wife had brought her. She looked better already, some color returning to her cheeks, though the bruises were still stark against her pale skin. "The sheriff is going to arrest Garrett," Wade told her, settling back into the chair by her bed. "You did the right thing telling him everything." Nina set down her broth with shaking hands. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if Garrett has friends? What if they come after me for getting him arrested?" "Then they'll have to go through me first," Wade said, and there was such conviction in his voice that Nina found herself believing him. "I'm not going anywhere, Nina. Not until this is finished and you're safe." "You don't owe me anything," Nina said softly. "You already saved my life. You don't have to stay." Wade leaned forward, his intense gray eyes locked on hers. "Maybe I don't have to, but I want to." "Unless you'd rather I leave." "No," Nina said quickly, then blushed at how eager she sounded. "I mean, I feel safer when you're here. I don't know why. I don't even know you. But when you carried me out of that barn, when you held me on your horse, I felt like nothing could hurt me as long as you were there." Something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them had words for yet. Wade reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Nina's ear, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. "Then I'll stay," he said simply. Over the next 3 days, Wade barely left Nina's side except to sleep at the boarding house at night. He was there when she ate her meals, encouraging her to take another bite even when she felt too weak. He was there when Doc Mason changed her bandages, holding her hand through the pain. He was there when the nightmares came, jolting her awake in the dark hours before dawn, and his deep voice would calm her, reminding her that she was safe. And slowly, Nina began to heal. Her body grew stronger, the wounds on her wrists and ankles beginning to close. Her voice returned fully, no longer raspy. The bruises faded from purple to yellow-green. But more than that, her spirit began to mend. The terror in her eyes was replaced by something else, determination, strength, and when she looked at Wade, something softer. Something that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks warm. Wade felt it too, though he tried to fight it at first. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself that he was better off that way. But Nina was changing something in him. When she smiled at him, genuinely smiled for the first time, it was like the sun breaking through clouds. When she laughed at something he said, a soft, melodic sound, he wanted to figure out ways to make her laugh again. And when she reached for his hand, seeking the comfort of his touch, he felt needed in a way that had nothing to do with his strength or his skills as a tracker. On the 4th day, Sheriff Coleman came by with news. "I've arrested Garrett Fletcher," he said, standing at the foot of Nina's bed. He denied everything, of course, but when I showed him the chains and the state of that barn, his story started to fall apart. Then I noticed the scratches on his face, still healing. His lawyer is trying to get him released on bail, but I'm fighting it. The circuit judge will be through in 2 weeks for the trial." Nina paled. 2 weeks? That's so soon." "Better to get it over with," Sheriff Coleman said kindly. "And Miss Ashford, I want you to know that the town is on your side. Word has spread about what happened and people are angry. Garrett Fletcher isn't as well liked as he thinks he is. After the sheriff left, Nina turned to Wade. "I don't think I can do this. Stand up in court, tell everyone what happened, face him again." Wade took her hand in both of his. "You can and you will. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Nina. You survived days chained in that barn. You survived Garrett Fletcher's cruelty. This is just one more thing to survive, and then it's over. And I'll be right there in that courtroom with you. I promise." Nina looked at their joined hands, at the way her small fingers disappeared in his large, calloused ones. She looked up at his face, at the strong jaw covered in dark stubble, the intense gray eyes that had seen her at her absolute worst, and somehow looked at her like she was something precious. This man, this mountain man who had stumbled upon her by chance, had become her anchor. And somewhere along the way, her feelings for him had grown into something more than gratitude. "Wade," she said softly, "why are you really staying? Most men would have delivered me to the doctor and moved on. You don't owe me anything." Wade was quiet for a long moment, and Nina watched emotions flicker across his usually stoic face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Because when I saw you in that barn, something in me broke. And when I carried you out, when I felt you trust me enough to lean against me, something in me started to heal. I've been alone in those mountains for years, Nina. Told myself I preferred it that way, that I didn't need anyone. But then there was you, looking at me with those green eyes, and suddenly being alone didn't seem like such a good idea anymore." Nina's breath caught. "Wade, She wasn't sure what to say, how to put into words the warmth spreading through her chest, the way her heart seemed to recognize him as something important, something essential. "You don't have to say anything," Wade said gently. "I know the timing is all wrong. You're healing and there's the trial, and I'm just a mountain man who doesn't even have a proper home to offer. But I needed you to know why I'm staying. It's not out of obligation. It's because I can't seem to make myself leave." Nina squeezed his hand. "I don't want you to leave. I don't think I could bear it if you did." The air between them felt charged, full of unspoken things. Wade leaned closer, and for a moment Nina thought he might kiss her. But instead, he pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture so tender it made tears spring to her eyes. "Rest now," he murmured. "You're still healing." That night, Wade lay awake in his rented room staring at the ceiling again. But this time, his thoughts weren't consumed with rage at Garrett Fletcher. Instead, they were full of Nina. The way she smiled, the sound of her voice, the feeling of her small hand in his. He was falling for her, had already fallen if he was honest with himself. But what future could they possibly have? She deserved stability, a real home, someone who could give her the life she'd lost when her parents died. All he had to offer was his strength, his protection, and a life that was half wild in the mountains. But even as he thought it, Wade found himself imagining something different. A cabin, solid and warm, somewhere in the foothills where the mountains met civilization. A place where Nina could have a garden if she wanted, where she'd be safe but where he could still breathe the mountain air. A place they could call home together. He fell asleep thinking about it, and for the first time in years, Wade Rourke dreamed of a future that included someone else. The 2 weeks before the trial passed in a strange rhythm. Nina grew stronger each day, and by the end of the first week, Doc Mason declared her well enough to leave his care. But she had nowhere to go. The room she'd rented at the boarding house before her abduction had been given to someone else, and she had no money to rent another. Wade solved that problem by renting a second room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, right next to his own. He made it clear to Mrs. Patterson and anyone else who asked that his intentions were honorable, that Nina simply needed a safe place to stay, and he was ensuring she had one. Mrs. Patterson, A romantic at heart despite her stern appearance, was more than happy to oblige. She took Nina under her wing, providing her with a proper dress to replace the torn one she'd been wearing, and treating her like the daughter she'd never had. During those 2 weeks, Wade and Nina spent their days together. He would escort her on short walks around town, helping her rebuild her strength. They would sit on the porch of the boarding house in the evenings, talking as the sun set. Nina told him about her childhood, about her parents, and the little house they'd lived in before the fever took them. She told him about her dreams of having a dress shop of her own someday, of creating beautiful things with her own hands. Wade told her about the mountains, about the life he'd lived there. He spoke of his family, gone so many years now, and the pain of losing them. He told her about the peace he'd found in solitude, but also about the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long winter nights. He found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone, and Nina listened with such attention, such genuine interest, that it made him feel truly seen for the first time in years. They were growing closer. Anyone could see it. The way Wade's hand would find the small of Nina's back when they walked. The way Nina would seek him out with her eyes across a room. The way they would sit close together on the porch, their shoulders touching, as comfortable in silence as they were in conversation. Mrs. Patterson watched them with knowing eyes and smiled to herself. She'd seen many things in her 60 years, but the connection between the mountain man and the young seamstress was something special, something real. The night before the trial, Nina couldn't sleep. She paced her small room at the boarding house, her stomach in knots. Tomorrow she would have to face Garrett Fletcher again. She would have to stand in front of the entire town and recount the worst experience of her life. And what if they didn't believe her? What if his lawyer made her look like a liar? What if Garrett went free? There was a soft knock on her door and Wade's voice came through. "Nina, I saw your lamp was still on. Are you all right?" Nina opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, dressed in his work pants and a loose shirt, his long hair hanging around his shoulders. He looked concerned, those gray eyes searching her face. "I can't stop thinking about tomorrow," Nina admitted. "I'm terrified." Wade glanced down the hallway, then back at her. "Can I come in? Just for a minute. I promise Mrs. Patterson won't have my head. I just want to talk to you." Nina nodded and stepped aside, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. Wade came in and guided her to sit on the edge of the bed while he pulled up the small chair from the desk. "Listen to me," Wade said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Tomorrow is going to be hard. I won't lie to you about that. But you're going to walk into that courtroom with your head held high and you're going to tell the truth. And the truth is powerful, Nina. It has a weight to it that lies can't match. That judge and jury, they'll see that. But what if they don't? What if Garrett goes free?" Wade's jaw clenched. "If by some miscarriage of justice that happens, then you and I will leave this town. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere he'll never find you, and we'll build a life there. But Nina, I don't think it's going to come to that. I think justice will be served tomorrow." Nina looked at him, this strong, solid man who had become her whole world in such a short time. "Wade, what happens after the trial? Assuming Garrett is convicted, what then? You'll go back to your mountains and I don't even know what I'll do." Wade reached out and cupped her cheek with his large, calloused hand. "Is that what you think? That I just leave? You have your life in the mountains. I can't expect you to give that up for me." "Nina," Wade said, his voice rough with emotion, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I found you. When I close my eyes, I see your face. When I'm away from you, even for a few hours, I feel like something's missing. I know it's fast, probably too fast, but I need you to know how I feel. I'm in love with you." I think I started falling the moment you grabbed my wrist in Doc Mason's office and asked me not to leave. Nina's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time. I love you too, she whispered. I was afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or that I was just confusing gratitude with something else. But it's not gratitude, it's love. Real love. Wade stood, pulling her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her. Nina pressed her face against his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth and strength of him surrounding her. She felt safe, cherished, loved. After the trial, Wade said, his lips against her hair, we'll figure out the rest, together. Maybe we'll stay here in Roswell, or maybe we'll build that cabin I've been dreaming about in the foothills. Wherever we go, as long as we're together, that's what matters. Nina pulled back just enough to look up at him. A cabin in the foothills sounds perfect. Wade smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger and almost carefree. He leaned down, and this time he didn't stop. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Nina's hands came up to grip his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath her fingers, and she kissed him back with all the emotion flooding through her. When they finally parted, both breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "Get some rest," he murmured. "Tomorrow we face Garrett Fletcher one last time, and then we can start thinking about our future." Nina nodded and reluctantly let him go. Wade left her room, but not before one last lingering look that made her heart skip. Nina lay down in her bed, her fingers touching her lips where his had been, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt genuine hope. Not just for justice, but for a future filled with love. The courtroom was packed the next morning. The trial of Garrett Fletcher had drawn attention from all over the territory, partly because of the serious nature of the charges, and partly because people were curious about the mountain man who had rescued Nina Ashford. Nina sat at the front, wearing the simple but respectable dress Mrs. Patterson had given her. Wade sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence, solid and reassuring. Sheriff Coleman had brought Garrett Fletcher in shackled, and Nina had forced herself to look at him. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt from 2 weeks in jail. The scratches she'd given him had healed into faint scars. When his eyes met hers, she saw rage there and something else. Fear. He knew he was facing serious consequences. The circuit judge, a stern man named Judge Harrison, called the court to order. The prosecution, led by a lawyer from Santa Fe who had taken on the case pro bono after hearing the details, presented their evidence methodically. They called Wade to the stand first. Wade testified about finding Nina chained in the barn, describing in detail the conditions she'd been in, the state of her injuries, the dehydration and malnutrition. His testimony was straightforward and damning. When Garrett's lawyer, a slick-talking man from Lincoln County, tried to suggest that Wade might be lying to protect Nina, Wade's eyes went cold. "I have no reason to lie," Wade said, his deep voice carrying through the courtroom. "I'm a tracker and a hunter. I deal in facts and evidence. And the fact is, I found that young woman chained like an animal, beaten and left to die. No one does that to someone without being purely evil." The judge had to call for order when the courtroom erupted in agreement. Sheriff Coleman testified next, describing the physical evidence in the barn, the chains, the state of the padlock Wade had broken. Then Doc Mason testified about Nina's injuries and his medical opinion on how long she'd been without proper food and water. Finally, it was Nina's turn. She walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, very aware of every eye in the room on her. But when she looked back and saw Wade, saw the faith and love in his eyes, her courage solidified. She told her story. All of it. From Garrett's initial unwanted attention to the night he'd broken into her room, to the days she'd spent chained in that barn, terrified and alone. Her voice wavered at times, but she didn't cry. She looked Garrett Fletcher right in the eye as she recounted every horrible thing he'd done, and she watched his composure crack bit by bit. Garrett's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she had encouraged his attention, that she was lying to get revenge for a relationship gone sour. But Nina stood firm, and the prosecution was quick to point out the physical evidence that supported every word of her testimony. The trial lasted all day. When it finally went to the jury, everyone filed out of the courtroom to wait. Wade immediately went to Nina, pulling her into his arms. "You were incredible," he told her. "So strong, so brave." "I couldn't have done it without you," Nina said, clinging to him. They didn't have to wait long. The jury came back in less than an hour with a guilty verdict. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Judge Harrison had to call for order again. He sentenced Garrett Fletcher to 15 years in the territorial prison, and it was only the presence of the sheriff's deputies that kept several men in the crowd from trying to deliver their own justice. As they led Garrett away, he turned and screamed at Nina, vile accusations and threats. But Wade simply stepped in front of her, blocking Garrett's view of her entirely with his broad frame. The message was clear. Garrett would never get near her again. Outside the courthouse, people congratulated Nina, shaking her hand and offering their support. Mrs. Patterson hugged her tight, tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Coleman clapped Wade on the shoulder, thanking him for his role in bringing a criminal to justice. But all Nina could think about was Wade. When they finally got away from the crowd, walking back toward the boarding house in the fading afternoon light, she stopped and turned to him. "It's over," she said, as if testing out the words. "It's really over. It's over," Wade confirmed. "And now we can start living." Over the next few weeks, Wade and Nina began to build their future. Wade had savings from years of selling furs and meat, and he used it to purchase a plot of land in the foothills about 5 miles from Roswell. It was beautiful country, with a creek running through it and a clear view of the mountains to the west. Perfect for the cabin Wade had been dreaming about. The town of Roswell rallied around them. Men showed up to help Wade build the cabin, cutting timber and raising walls. Women brought food and supplies, helping Nina plan her new home. It seemed like the whole town had adopted them, wanting to be part of their happy ending after the darkness of what had come before. Wade worked from dawn to dusk on the cabin, his powerful muscles straining as he lifted beams and hammered nails. Nina watched him sometimes, admiring the way his body moved, the competence and skill with which he worked. She was falling more in love with him every day, if that was even possible. The cabin took shape over the course of 6 weeks. It was solid and well built, with 2 rooms and a loft, a large fireplace, and windows that let in plenty of light. Wade even built a separate room for Nina to use as a sewing space, knowing she wanted to continue her work as a seamstress. On a warm September evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Wade and Nina stood in front of their nearly completed cabin. Wade's arm was around her waist, and Nina leaned into his side, feeling content and safe. "Marry me," Wade said suddenly. Nina looked up at him in surprise. "What?" Wade turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Marry me, Nina. I know we haven't known each other long, but I know my heart. I love you. I want to build this life with you officially. I want you to be my wife." Nina's eyes filled with happy tears. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Wade let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and pulled her into a kiss that made her head spin. When they finally broke apart, both laughing with joy, Wade lifted her off her feet and spun her around, her skirts flying. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Roswell. Mrs. Patterson stood as Nina's witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony. Sheriff Coleman stood up for Wade, looking pleased to see the mountain man settling down. Half the town attended, cramming into the little church to witness the union of the seamstress and the mountain man who had saved her. Nina wore a dress she'd made herself, simple but beautiful, in a soft ivory color. She'd woven wildflowers into her hair, which hung long and loose down her back. When Wade saw her walking toward him down the aisle, his expression made her heart soar. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Wade had cleaned up for the occasion, his long hair neatly tied back, his face freshly shaven, wearing new clothes that actually fit his muscular frame properly. He looked handsome and strong in hers. They spoke their vows with hands clasped and eyes locked, meaning every word. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Wade cupped Nina's face gently and kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed. The town threw them a reception at the hotel, with food and music and dancing. Wade, who claimed he didn't know how to dance, let Nina teach him, stumbling through a waltz while she laughed and guided his steps. It was imperfect and wonderful, and Nina couldn't remember ever being happier. As the evening wore on, they slipped away from the celebration, eager to begin their new life together. Wade lifted Nina onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arms secure around her as they rode through the twilight toward their cabin in the foothills. The cabin was lit from within by the fire Wade had laid that morning, and it glowed like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Wade dismounted and reached up to help Nina down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he cradled her in his arms. "Tradition," he said with a smile, and carried her over the threshold of their new home. Inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. Nina had spent the last week making it a home, adding curtains and rugs, stocking the kitchen, arranging furniture. Now it was truly theirs. Wade set Nina down gently and she turned to him, suddenly shy. This was their wedding night, and while they'd shared kisses and embraces, there was a new intimacy ahead of them now. Wade seemed to sense her nervousness because he took her hand and simply held it, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "We have all the time in the world," he said softly. "There's no rush, Nina. We can just sit by the fire if you'd like. Talk. I'm happy just being with you." Nina's love for him swelled even larger. Here was this powerful man, this mountain man who could survive alone in the wilderness, being so incredibly gentle and patient with her. She stepped closer, placing her free hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. "I'm not nervous because I don't want this," she said, looking up into his gray eyes. "I'm nervous because I want it so much. I want you, Wade. I want to be your wife in every way." Wade's eyes darkened with emotion and desire. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, deeper than before, and Nina felt heat bloom through her body. His hands moved to her hair, carefully removing the wildflowers and setting them aside, then working at the pins that held her hair up. It tumbled down around her shoulders, and Wade ran his fingers through it, marveling at the softness. Nina's hands went to the buttons of his shirt, and Wade stilled, letting her undress him. She'd seen his arms before, knew he was muscular, but when she pushed the shirt off his shoulders and saw his full torso, she gasped. He was magnificent, all hard planes and defined muscle, his chest broad and strong. She ran her hands over him, fascinated by the contrast between her small, pale hands and his tanned, powerful body. Wade's breathing had gone ragged. He turned her gently and worked at the buttons on the back of her dress, his fingers surprisingly deft despite their size. The dress pooled at her feet, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. She stepped out of the pile of fabric, and Wade picked her up again, carrying her to the bed that dominated one corner of the main room. He laid her down gently and paused, just looking at her, his expression full of wonder. "You're so beautiful," he murmured. "I can't believe you're mine." "I am yours," Nina said, reaching for him. "Just as you're mine." Wade joined her on the bed, and they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other, showing each other without words just how deep their love ran. Nina had been afraid, after what Garrett had tried to do to her, that this intimacy might be tainted by those memories. But with Wade, it was different. Everything was gentle and loving, his every touch reverent. He made sure of her comfort and pleasure above his own, and when they finally joined together fully as husband and wife, it was beautiful and right. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Nina's head on Wade's chest, his arms around her, both of them content and complete. "I love you," Nina whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me." Wade pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before, not really living. You gave me a reason to come down from those mountains, a reason to build something permanent. You gave me a home, Nina, not just this cabin, but you. You're my home." Nina tilted her head up to kiss him, pouring all her love into it. They fell asleep wrapped in each other, warm and safe and deeply happy. The first year of their marriage was full of joy and hard work. Wade continued to hunt and trap, but now he came home to Nina every evening instead of staying out in the wilderness for weeks at a time. Nina set up her sewing business, and word spread quickly about her skill. Women from Roswell and even from neighboring towns came to her for dresses and alterations. She was building a good reputation and bringing in steady income. They worked together to improve their homestead. Wade built a chicken coop and bought Nina some hens so she could have fresh eggs. They planted a garden, and Nina discovered she had a talent for growing vegetables. Wade dug a root cellar to store food for the winter. They acquired a milk cow and a second horse. Slowly but surely, they were creating a life. They also created a place of refuge. Word had spread about what Wade had done for Nina, and occasionally, others who were in trouble found their way to the cabin in the foothills. Wade and Nina never turned anyone away. They provided shelter, food, and help to those who needed it, whether it was a family passing through who had fallen on hard times or someone running from danger. Their home became known as a safe place, and that reputation meant everything to both of them. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Nina discovered she was pregnant. She told Wade one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and his reaction was everything she'd hoped for. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his voice rough with emotion as he told her how happy he was, how much he loved her, how he couldn't wait to meet their child. The pregnancy was healthy, and Nina bloomed with it. Wade was attentive and protective, insisting she not work too hard, bringing her little gifts from town, talking to her growing belly when he thought she was asleep. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving intricate designs into the wood. He was going to be a wonderful father. In November, as the first snows began to dust the mountains, Nina went into labor. Mrs. Patterson came out to the cabin to help, along with a midwife from town. Wade paced outside, chopping wood to distract himself, jumping at every sound from inside the cabin. When he finally heard the cry of a baby, he dropped his axe and ran inside. Nina was lying in their bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears of joy streaming down her face. "It's a boy," she said. "We have a son, Wade." Wade approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the tiny baby in Nina's arms. His son. He had a son. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and was wailing indignantly at being born. Wade reached out with one large finger and touched the baby's tiny hand, and immediately the little fingers wrapped around his, gripping tight. "He's perfect," Wade breathed. "Nina, he's perfect." They named him William after Wade's father. Little William Rourke was the joy of their lives. Wade was a natural father, despite his initial nervousness. He would hold William against his broad chest, the baby looking impossibly tiny in his large hands, and sing old songs in his deep voice until William fell asleep. He would change diapers without complaint, walk the floor with William when he was fussy, and beam with pride at every little milestone. Nina watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This strong, powerful man was so incredibly gentle with their child, so patient and loving. They were a family, and it was everything she'd ever wanted but never thought she'd have. The years passed in a blur of happiness. William grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a young boy. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he was curious and adventurous and full of life. Wade taught him about the land, about tracking and hunting and respecting nature. Nina taught him to read and write, to be kind and compassionate. When William was 3, Nina became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, and Wade cried tears of joy when he held his little girl for the first time. Margaret had Nina's green eyes and was as sweet-tempered as her brother was adventurous. Wade loved both his children fiercely, but there was something about having a daughter that made him even more protective, if that was possible. 2 years after Margaret was born, Nina gave birth to another son, James. Their cabin in the foothills had grown over the years, Wade adding more rooms to accommodate their expanding family. They had built a good life, full of love and laughter and purpose. Occasionally, someone would ask Nina about what had happened to her all those years ago, about the ordeal with Garrett Fletcher. She would always say the same thing, that it was part of her past, that she'd survived it, and that she wouldn't let it define her. What defined her was the life she'd built with Wade, the family they'd created, the love they shared. Garrett Fletcher died in prison 5 years into his sentence, killed in a fight with another inmate. When Nina heard the news, she felt nothing. He was a chapter of her life that had closed long ago. She was too busy living to dwell on the past. Wade thrived as a father and husband. The man who had once preferred solitude now couldn't imagine life without his noisy, chaotic, loving family. He still went into the mountains sometimes, still hunted and trapped, but he always came home. Home to Nina, to his children, to the life they'd built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade and Nina stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children were inside, William reading to his younger siblings, their voices drifting out through the open window. "You ever miss it?" Nina asked, leaning into Wade's side. "The solitude of the mountains, the freedom of that life." Wade wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Not for a second. That life was just me waiting, even if I didn't know it, waiting for you, waiting for this. You gave me everything, Nina. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I didn't think that was possible." Nina turned in his arms, wrapping her own around his waist. "I love you too. You saved my life, Wade, not just that day in the barn, but every day since. You showed me what love really is, what it means to be cherished and protected and valued. You gave me a family when I thought I'd lost everything. You gave me a future when I couldn't see past my fear. You gave me everything." Wade cupped her face and kissed her, a kiss full of 10 years of love and partnership and devotion. When they pulled apart, both smiling, William's voice called out from inside. "Ma, Pa, come see." James took his first steps. They hurried inside together, laughing to celebrate this new milestone with their youngest. The cabin was warm and bright, filled with the sound of their children's excitement and joy. This was home. This was family. This was the life they'd built together from tragedy and pain, transforming it into something beautiful and lasting. As the years continued to pass, Wade and Nina grew older together, their love deepening with time. Their children grew up strong and kind, carrying the lessons their parents had taught them out into the world. William became a rancher, Margaret married a schoolteacher and became a teacher herself, and James followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a skilled tracker and hunter. Wade and Nina became grandparents, their cabin once again filled with the sounds of children's laughter. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains that had been such an important part of their story, holding hands and remembering. "Do you remember the day we met?" Nina asked one evening, her hair now streaked with gray, her face lined but still beautiful to Wade. "Every detail," Wade said, his own hair now more silver than dark, his body still strong but bearing the marks of age and hard work. "I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so brave. You were chained in that barn, terrified and hurt, but when you looked at me, there was still fight in your eyes. I knew right then you were something special." "I remember thinking you were the biggest man I'd ever seen," Nina said with a smile. "I was terrified of you at first, but then you spoke, and your voice was so gentle. And when you broke those chains and carried me out, I felt safe for the first time in so long. I think I started falling in love with you that very day." Wade raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Best day of my life finding you. Everything good that happened after started with that day." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Their life hadn't been perfect. They'd faced hardships, losses, difficult times. But they'd faced everything together. Their love the foundation that held them steady through every storm. As the moon rose over the mountains, Wade and Nina went inside their cabin, the home they'd built with their own hands and filled with love. They climbed into bed together as they had every night for decades, and Wade pulled Nina close, her back to his chest, his arms around her. "I love you, Nina Rourke," he murmured into her hair. "I love you, Wade Rourke," she replied, covering his hands with her own. They fell asleep like that. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a beautiful life from the ashes of trauma and pain, who had loved each other every single day with devotion and passion and commitment. They had created a legacy of love that would live on through their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of compassion, of choosing to save someone when you could just as easily walk away, of opening your heart even when it seems impossible. The mountain man had found her chained in a barn like an animal, broken and afraid. He'd broken the lock and carried her to safety, and in doing so, had saved them both. From that dark beginning had grown something beautiful and lasting. A love story for the ages, set against the wild backdrop of the New Mexico territory, a story of healing and hope and happily ever after. And when Wade and Nina were very old, sitting on their porch surrounded by their children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, they would tell the story of how they met. The children would listen with wide eyes, gasping at the scary parts and sighing at the romantic parts. And every time, the story would end the same way, with a mountain man and a seamstress who loved each other more than anything, who built a life together in the foothills, who proved that, even from the darkest circumstances, love can bloom and flourish and last forever. Their story became legend in Roswell and the surrounding territory. People would point out the cabin in the foothills, and tell newcomers about Wade and Nina Rourke, about how their love story began and the beautiful life they'd built. Young couples would visit them, asking for advice on marriage and family. Wade would always say the same thing: protect what's yours, cherish who you love, and never take a single day for granted. Nina would add, and choose someone who sees you at your worst and loves you anyway, someone who will carry you when you can't walk, someone who will fight for you and stand beside you through anything. As they grew into their 70s, Wade's body finally began to slow down. His knees ached from years of trekking through the mountains. His hands were stiff from decades of hard work. But his love for Nina never wavered. He would still bring her wildflowers from the meadow, still kiss her every morning and every night, still look at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Nina's eyesight began to fail, making sewing difficult, but she never complained. She had everything she needed: her family, her home, and Wade, always Wade, her constant, her protector, her love. One evening in late spring, when the wildflowers were blooming across the foothills and the mountains were green with new growth, Wade and Nina sat on their porch watching another sunset. They were both moving slower now, both feeling the weight of their years, but their hands were clasped together as always. "We had a good life, didn't we?" Nina asked softly. Wade squeezed her hand. "The best life. No regrets, Nina, not a single one." "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you'd taken a different path that day? If you'd gone north instead of south, if you'd never heard me screaming in that barn?" Wade turned to look at her, his gray eyes still intense despite his age. "I think fate had a hand in it. I think we were always meant to find each other one way or another. You were mine to save, and I was yours to heal. That's how it was always going to be." Nina smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I like that. I like thinking we were always meant to be." They sat like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Around them, their homestead bustled with life. Their son William and his family lived in a house he'd built on the other side of their property. Margaret visited every Sunday with her husband and children. James had built a cabin about a mile away, close enough to help but far enough to have his own space. The Rourke family had put down deep roots in the New Mexico territory, and it all traced back to that day when a mountain man broke a lock and carried a scared, hurting woman to safety. Every good thing in their lives, every moment of joy, every child and grandchild, it all stemmed from that single act of compassion and the love that had grown from it. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Wade helped Nina up from her chair. They moved slowly inside, his arm around her waist, her head leaning against his shoulder. They prepared for bed together, a routine they'd perfected over decades, and climbed under the quilts that Nina had made years ago. Wade pulled Nina close, just as he had every night of their marriage, and she snuggled into his warmth with a contented sigh. They talked quietly about their day, about their children and grandchildren, about plans for the summer garden. Normal things, everyday things, the comfortable conversation of two people who knew each other completely. "Wade," Nina said after a while, "promise me something, anything. Promise me you'll remember that you gave me the most beautiful life. Even on the hard days, remember that. You saved me, you loved me, you gave me a family and a home and more happiness than any one person deserves. You were everything I needed, everything I could have hoped for." Wade's arms tightened around her. "I promise. And you remember that you saved me too. You gave this lonely mountain man a reason to come home every night. You gave me love and laughter and purpose. You made me better than I was. You were my everything, Nina. Always will be." Nina smiled in the darkness. "Always," she agreed. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two hearts beating in sync as they had for so many years. The cabin was quiet and peaceful, filled with the memories of a lifetime spent loving each other. Wade and Nina Rourke lived many more years in their cabin in the foothills, surrounded by the family they'd created and the love they'd nurtured. When they finally passed, many years later and within days of each other because neither could bear to be without the other for long, they were laid to rest on a hill overlooking their homestead with a view of the mountains Wade had once called home. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood at their graves, mourning the loss but celebrating the incredible legacy of love Wade and Nina had left behind. The story of the mountain man and the seamstress would be told for generations, passed down through the family, a reminder that love can emerge from even the darkest circumstances, that compassion and courage can change lives, and that true love, once found, lasts forever. The cabin in the foothills still stands, maintained by the Rourke family, a monument to Wade and Nina's love story. Visitors can still see the porch where they sat every evening, the bedroom where they slept wrapped in each other's arms, the kitchen where Nina taught her children to cook, the workshop where Wade crafted furniture for their growing family. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, some say you can still feel the love that filled that place, can almost hear the echo of laughter and voices from years gone by. The story of Wade and Nina Rourke proved that heroes come in all forms, that sometimes salvation arrives in the shape of a mountain man who hears a cry for help and chooses to act, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that the best love stories aren't the ones that come easily, but the ones that are forged in fire and tempered by adversity. From a barn where a woman was chained like an animal to a cabin in the foothills filled with love and family, Wade and Nina's journey was one of transformation and redemption. He saved her life that day, but she saved his soul. Together, they built something beautiful and lasting, a love that would echo through generations, inspiring their descendants to be brave, to be kind, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, and to love with everything they have. And in the end, that's the greatest legacy anyone could leave. Proof that love conquers all, that goodness exists even in dark times, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open your heart to another person and let them in completely. Wade and Nina did that, and in doing so, they created a love story that would never be forgotten, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and commitment. Their story, which began in horror and pain, ended in peace and profound love, exactly as it should. The mountain man found her chained in a barn like an animal, broke the lock, and carried her to safety. But what happened next, the beautiful life they built together, the family they created, the love they shared for over 50 years, that was their choice, their triumph, their happily ever after. And it was perfect.